Hello, it is on this day, May 9th, 2022, that I'm explaining what the asexuality spectrum is. Now, I will flat out say at the beginning of this video, this is one of the hardest identities for me to explain to people, including my own family, and it's one of the ones with the most misleading definitions on the internet. When I was doing research for this video, all of the top results I found when I was Googling for definitions were all definitions I was not comfortable with, and they're the top results that people see the most. And so in this video I'm going to try my best to explain the asexuality spectrum and convey how it's just as open as the gender spectrum. What I mean by that is that the gender spectrum for gender diverse people has the umbrella term transgender, but there are many different experiences inside that can really vary in between them. And even though transgender is the umbrella term, not all the people with these different experiences relate to the term transgender, or like the word transgender for them. And so asexuality is similar in that it has this umbrella term asexual, or the umbrella term graysexual, depending. We'll get into that later. But all the different experiences inside the asexuality spectrum cannot be described by that term and can also really vary and be very diverse between them. And so it is very open, and there's a lot of different experiences inside of here, and you cannot make assumptions relating them, if that makes sense. So you can't really relate non-binary to gender fluid. You cannot relate different asexual labels as well, if that makes sense. And so that's kind of how I'm going to begin to explain this. It has a lot of terms under it, and there's a lot of research into those terms, and this video will dive into a lot of the most common terms, or the terms you'll see the most, but it does not dive into all of them. There is a very long list of asexual spectrum labels. Alright, now before I move on and get into some of those labels, I want to emphasize the word attraction. Attraction. Okay, we got it? Attraction. Okay? Okay? Regardless of anyone's identity on the asexuality spectrum, you cannot conclude anything either direction about their desire, want, willingness, or ability to have sex. I'm going to repeat that one more time for you, okay? Are we ready? Attraction. Regardless of anyone's identity on the asexuality spectrum, you cannot conclude anything about their desire, want, willingness, or ability to have sex. Okay? Alright, we're good? Okay. I really want to make that clear. People in the asexuality spectrum can have sex, and not all people in the asexuality spectrum experience sex repulsion, which is a term I will dive into a lot more in another video. But I just really need to make that clear. And like, this is pretty basic, I feel, to me, but allosexual people, people who feel sexual attraction, the majority of our population, also can not be interested in sex, or be interested in sex as they please. We are the exact same. Regardless of how we experience our attraction, it doesn't mean, it doesn't define our want, willingness, or literal capability to have sex. And so, again, I really want to make that clear and drive that home. It's a very ranty subject, and it is a very common misconception. So everybody can vary and feel differently on that subject, and it's just communication and figuring out what that specific individual feels. But don't assume anything based on their label. Alright, now with that said, and hopefully drilled in, though it's not been said enough, we can start to loosely explain some of the most common labels on the asexuality spectrum, apart from asexual itself, which means that that person does not feel asexual attraction. Okay, we good? Okay. So starting with the other umbrella term for the asexuality spectrum, we have gray asexual. Gray asexual is a label that people can use to identify themselves if they feel they are in the gray area between allosexual, people who feel sexual attraction, and asexual, people who can't feel sexual attraction. So generally they can feel sexual attraction, but rarely, weakly, or ambiguously, or with in a lot of different ways, but just not like an allosexual person can, but also feels more than an asexual person does. So again, I think the best definition for that is the gray area between the two. Again, these are all very basic general definitions, and they will not convey everyone's experience, and so I want to make that clear as well. But that's the overarching meaning of gray asexual. A lot of the next terms will come in pairs, so we will start to explain two at a time. First, we have demisexual and fraysexual. Demisexuality is a label for people who only experience sexual attraction once they have an emotional bond with the person in question, and fraysexual is a label that people can use if they have the opposite experience and their sexual attraction dissipates as soon as they form an emotional bond. Now, to clarify, because this is a misconception people have said to me multiple times, and I identify as demisexual, demisexual doesn't mean that the person just wants to know someone before they hook up, or whatever phrasing you hear. Because demisexual is a term that describes not being able to feel sexual attraction at all for anybody unless they have that connection or bond or whatever interaction they have to change that perception and feel that way. So it's not a matter of just needing to like know the person before they are like interested to have sex. It's a lot more, I'm sorry to use this word, but complicated than that. So I really wanted to say that, and I also wanted to note that for both fraysexual and demisexual, it doesn't necessarily have to be a long time. Just because they need, like, the emotional bond alters how they experience attraction, doesn't mean that it has to be a long time. That bond can form fast, just depending on the circumstances. Alright, the next pair are agosexual and autosexual. I almost messed that up, I am sorry. Agosexual is a label people can use if they experience a disconnection between themselves and the subject of their attraction / arousal. This is the one time you will hear me say arousal, and I'll explain it in a minute. And autosexual is a label for people who largely experience sexual attraction towards themselves. So, agosexual specifically is a hard identity to explain to people who have not experienced, and I also identify as agosexual. I'll get into later how I identify as multiple, but it's really hard to explain, and when you Google it, all the top results will directly link the definition to sex and porn and masturbation, and I feel very shaky with those definitions because that's not how I experience agosexual, and that's not, it gives the perception that all agosexual people have to enjoy porn or masturbation or whatever, and that is not true. And so the best I can explain this with my personal experience is that I can distinctly tell that that attraction to that person or whatever is like separate from me. Like if I were someone else, then maybe it would like make sense or like develop more. Or if I feel something, but then as soon as I realize that it's me that's feeling something, then it goes away. I know that that's really hard to understand, and you don't really have to understand it, But it's like the attraction just cuts off. It gets disconnected as soon as I'm part of the picture. And this, for me, is just attraction. It doesn't have to do with sex. It can just purely be the attraction itself. So, again, it's really hard to explain. We're just gonna move on. Finally, the last two labels I'll explain, which are not related to each other, are Koisexual and aceflux. I don't actually know if I'm saying Koisexual right, because I've never heard anyone pronounce it, so feel free to correct me. Koisexual is a label for people who are unsure whether they've ever felt sexual attraction, which, honestly, kind of relatable. And aceflux is a term and an orientation would be a better word to use in this case, for people who fluctuate across the asexuality spectrum. And so I myself identify as aceflux, and I have my labels under aceflux that I fluctuate in between pretty much randomly. And so I just wanted to explain right here at the end that yes, people can experience more than one label of asexuality as well. They don't have to be just one. And in general, across all labels and terms in the gender and sexuality, community, people aren't just locked into one term because they identified as it. People can change. And so not only can people experience multiple things, not only can people be demisexual and bisexual, but also, as well, people aren't just set as one thing because they said it once. So they are what they feel, and I can tell you right now that 13-year-old me could not identify with the asexuality terms that I identify with now. And so people can have multiple labels, and also people can change. These two things are not related, but they're both things you need to recognize. Good? I hope we're good. So I know that was a lot of information and a lot of definitions, and I really do hope that this can serve as a starting point to learning and understanding or relating to these identities. But it's very important to note that it's really hard to explain these identities or convey them, and some of these definitions in particular, especially agosexual, are ones that I defined with my own bias. So please, please, please take these definitions with a grain of salt and understand that while these are labels many people identify with, all these people using these labels can interpret or experience them differently. So there's really some big variances in people's definitions or perceptions of these labels, and we can't just magically teleport into someone's mind and see how they experience their attraction. So again, just be understanding that while one person can experience an identity one way, not everybody experiences that same label or identity that way. These are just words to help us talk about these things and convey how we feel, but really everyone's different. So that leads to my last point. This video is just one source, and I highly recommend looking through other sources and seeing other people's perspectives and cross-analyzing and everything. Don't just take my word, because I am one person and I'm one person. Don't just accept my way as the way of the world, because it is not, for the love of everything. So, grain of salt, and I recommend looking out there for other resources, and hopefully a lot more of these kinds of videos develop more and more with time. I do recommend David J. Bradley. He's one of the first YouTubers I discovered that explain things really well, and I think that would be a good place to start. But there are many other people out there as well. With that, I hope I will see you all soon. Goodbye.